Hi, this is Paul. This is commentary on the second hour. We'll see if I can get through the whole second hour because we'll have to talk about the psychedelic thing. And I just watched the Jonathan Pageau Bishop Barron conversation, which I thought was very good. And Jonathan Pageau basically says it's always the psychedelic thing. And I'm reading it in the comments and, just take the mushrooms, Paul. Well, why should I? I mean, it's so funny. All these people who are antagonist about standpoint epistemology, they pull a standpoint epistemology move when it comes to mushrooms. And part of the validity of standpoint epistemology is, I don't know what it's like to be you. You don't know what it's like to be me. But when we sort of talk together, we try to imagine, we get some things right, we get some things wrong. So let's dive into the psychedelic portion of this conversation. Now, I debated whether or not I would do this. Symbolically memeing got at this thing fast. And it's entitled, What Jonathan Thinks When Jordan Talks About Psychedelics. And symbolically memeing. There's no hiding from the camera. So, everybody's face in front of the camera. And, well, he always does this with Jonathan when he does these things.
Ontological significance of psychedelic substances.
Drugs.
Psychedelic substance.
Into the mix, and that's a thorny problem if there ever was one. And that's a
Pageau gives the, oh no, here we go.
problem of the lower meeting the higher, that's for sure. Right? These chemical substances that can...
Lips purse, eyes narrow. All the tells. Jonathan's under stress.
reliably induce overwhelming mystical experiences.
No, thank you.
You can just set that
He puts his little voices in the background.
aside and say, well, that's a form of insanity, but it's not schizophrenia.
And Bishop Barron adjusts the chair and he sits up and he purses his lips. It's like, all right, brace yourself, Effie. Mrs. Doubtfire.
Drugs.
It's not obviously within the category of mental illness.
There's facial stuff going on for George Jonathan.
And to
Drugs.
Murescu's
Don't do drugs. If you're doing it, stop it. Get some help.
Yeah, it's cheating.
When you're using drugs,
It goes on from there. Oh, great. Sign into the editor. No, leave me alone. Sorry about that. People say, well, the church is going to have to deal with it. And that sounds like that's kind of what we're doing now, is we're having to figure out how to deal with it. And the way we deal with these things is we have conflicts and we have conversations and we have discussions. The way the church is dealing with the same-sex marriage debate and the way the church is dealing with the women in office debate and the way the church is dealing with all sorts of issues with respect to sexuality and how many other issues. This is how the church deals with things. Now, it'll probably play out more in the Protestant churches, because Protestant land tends to be the big experimental place where stuff gets tried. And, it was atheist churches were tried. They didn't go anywhere. Maybe someone's going to start an entire psychedelic denomination. Well, let's see. Let's see if you can scale it. Let's see if it's stable. Let's see if it passes the Darwinian test. I can only decide for me. My answer is no. That's the way I feel about it. But let's get into this here, because I think actually a really good conversation can be had about this, but maybe we have to talk about it directly. And I thought actually, again, in this conversation, John Vervaeke did a really good job of laying out some things that Bishop Barron could agree with. And so maybe it's I had a conversation with Sevilla about psychedelics, our last conversation that we had. So who knows where we'll go with this. But there's a number of lines to think about this that don't tend to be addressed.
Point is, right, we've suffered.
This is the context. John talks about the tyranny of the propositional.
Kind of a propositional tyranny from Occam on, where we reduced all of knowing to the propositional. And I would argue that most of what I called religio is being carried on by the procedural and the perspectival and the participatory. And so that is in a fundamental way how it's not just out there, it's like right in the guts of our self-interpretation.
Yeah, the question, I think one of the questions is what is the ontological significance of that, let's say? I mean, one of the...
Okay, now that question with respect to what's the ontological significance of the tyranny of the propositional? Well, I think an easy one is that, as John earlier sort of critiqued, everything was imagined to be based upon the material, because the material in space and time lends itself to the propositional. So if, in fact, we are discovering that the tyranny of the propositional has inhibited us to know and engage and flourish in the world, then perhaps some of the foundational presuppositions of that should be challenged. I'm not going to play any of the video, but John Vervaeke just did another conversation with Sam from the Bridges of Meaning Discord server on purpose, non-theism, and Christianity. And it was an outstanding conversation. They covered a wide range of things, sort of following up on my conversation with J.P. Marceau, with John Vervaeke, and also Sam's previous conversation with John Vervaeke. And it was, I thought, an excellent good faith exploration of between this non-theist and a non-Trinitarian Christian. It was a good conversation, and it has to do with to what degree can we make ontological presumptions based on our experience. I mean, that's J.P. Marceau and I, explored that quite a bit with John, and Jonathan Pageau just on Twitter told me next week he's going to talk to Vervaeke about, do angels exist? So that will be barking up the same tree. And so I think as we're trying to recalibrate from the propositional overreach, this tyranny of the proposition, there's going to be a lot more examination on what we're doing with respect to ontology. What do I mean by ontology? With respect to being. Epistemology has to do with knowing. Axiology has to do with morality. But ontology has to do with being. And so our knowledge of existence.
Leaving aside the truth or lack thereof of various religious claims, one of the weaknesses, I believe, of the rational atheist's position is that, first of all, that their argument is carried out almost entirely in the propositional landscape. Yes. They treat religion as if it's a set of propositions.
And atheism, modern atheism, really is a development of modern Protestantism in many ways, or I think Vervaeke would push it back to the rise of nominalism and seeing modern atheism as the rise of nominalism. Nominalism, again, the idea that all categories, as we talked about in the first hour, all categories are impositions from us onto the world, that the categories are in no way, a whole bunch of things aren't really out there in the world, meaning morality becomes a big debating point, but categories, nominalism is the assertion that all the categories come from us.
That are in some sense expressed in a manner contrary to the propositions that constitute science. And then I think, well, wait a minute, guys, you're missing the point here. And there's a propositional element to religious claim, and I often think that's the weakest element of. But what do you make of the fact that people have religious experiences? What do you make of that exactly? And when you say, well, that's epiphenomenal, it's like, well, yeah.
And again, epiphenomenal meaning these are the things that we as human beings, as agents, are projecting onto the phenomenon. Okay?
Is it really? Like, are you so sure about that? So let me give you an example. So I talked to Brian Murarescu and Carl Ruck a while back, and they'd be doing some investigation into the Eleusinian mysteries. And Murarescu's book is predicated on the idea that what the Greeks were doing was using an LSD spiked wine, essentially, to produce a collective mystical experience and they had technologies to harness that so it was collective. And
okay, so I did a treatment of that video a little bit using the after school video because I thought Murescu's treatment, his thesis was summed up fairly well in the after school video. Maybe I can find it. Okay, I did this back in July. I entitled it Ontological Presuppositions Impact Take on Psychedelics. I guess in some ways it's not dissimilar to the little short video that I made before.
And that constituted the core of the Eleusinian mysteries, and that enterprise was practiced by the ancient Greeks for thousands of years continuously, and that experience was at the basis of the unity of Greek culture, but more than that it was the fountain from which Greek wisdom flowed.
And again, I go back to why Pageau asked, well, Pageau challenged, what video was that he did that? I just played that. That was the that was the Genesis video on the symbolic world on Jordan's channel. He said, if these were sacred rites, Jonathan sort of inverts the standpoint epistemology argument and says, if in fact this is sort of a world unto itself and a completely buffered self-isolated world, how can you judge it from another world? And that's one of the things that we wrestle with.
And so it's a revelatory hypothesis, by which I mean, it's a hypothesis about the function of revelation in a society. If these...
Okay, the revelation of what? Now, this is where the little video I made, it sort of sticks with me. So it's helpful to remember a few things here. So in, let's say, the old world, you have heaven and earth, and they're separated, and the gods reveal things from heaven to earth. That's part of the reason that you have astrology, where you look at the stars, where the gods disclose their will. Again, you can, read plenty of case situations in history where they go to the Oracle of Delphi. You can hear all of this on The Rest is History. Okay, that's all part of this discarded image that gets thrown away. And then you have modernity. And Charles Taylor nicely talks about modernity, where you have the buffered self. And a big part of the discussion between, let's say, Christians who continue to occupy, although cross-pressured by modernism, continue to occupy more of a traditional world, and those who say, well, these are just chemical substances going into the body, altering brain states, is danger. Because in the buffered self, everything that you are going to unlock with these drugs in the modern frame is already just in your head. That's the frame. Now, Peterson is always sort of edgy in these things, and so he's always just comes right up to the line here in a lot of ways and speaks psychologically, but is very careful about ontology, and he's always saying that these things are suggested. So, but you have to remember that we're really having this conversation in two separate worlds. And what I see a lot of this is sort of switching between them. And this, I think, is where John Vervaeke's comments are going to be a little bit more clarifying, because generally speaking, Christians are occupying this world right here, where we have a more vigorous ontology about heaven and earth, and therefore these drugs aren't simply elements of a buffered self, but are potentially, if they in fact are revelatory, well, what are we getting this revelation from? Christians for a long time have had issues with divination. Israel was quite different, and in some ways seeming more secular, in that they had pretty specific rules about divination. There were to be no witches in the land. They had the Urim and Thummim, but they basically left it to the prophets to hear from the Lord about things of this nature. The idea of a buffered self gets rid of divination because, well, person takes something into the body, and this is part of the back and forth that goes on over sort of the Barfieldian question of participation. I, in my men's Bible study, just recently read the passage where Jesus says it's not what you put into your mouth that makes you that makes you, oh shoot, what was the word? It's not what you put into your mouth that defiles you. It's what comes out of your heart. And so within Christianity, there's a long back and forth about what belongs on the heaven side, what belongs on the earth side, and how these two things are related. Now, in terms of a buffered self, you put a drug in, you are expecting that on this end of things, that there will be, in fact, chemical reactions and whatnot. The question is are we really dealing with a dualist system? And we're talking about Cartesian dualism of a spiritual substance and a material substance. Or are there, in fact, as in almost all traditional religions, ideas that certain substances will open you up to the world of the spirits, and those spirits will inhabit you? I was a missionary in the Dominican Republic, and if you would go to a curandero or a brujo or some other animistic healer, they're still around in places in the Caribbean, and you can find them in various different communities. Often the exchange would be give him a cigar, give him some alcohol, give him some money. He'll use the alcohol, and he'll have, sometimes they're called a caballo or a horse, and the spirit will mount the individual, and basically there's an exchange that happens. You pay some money, you pay some money to the witch or the caballo or the curandero, and they get the money, but then they let the spirit mount them, and the spirit enjoys physicality, and in exchange for that, the spirit will curse people, tell you lost items, on and on and on. Now again, with the buffered self, the idea is that all of this is hogwash. All of this is superstition. There's no problem there. So therefore, psychedelics are simply a medical treatment. Are they? Which side of the line are we really paying attention to in this conversation?
And that enterprise was practiced by the ancient Greeks for thousands of years continuously, and that experience was at the basis of the unity of Greek culture, but more than that it was the fountain from which Greek wisdom flowed. And
it was abandoned. And what was that name of the Vervaeke's guy? John regularly brings up Pierre Hadot. And there's a very I didn't know anything about Pierre Hadot. And there's a very interesting article written about him in First Things, What is Ancient Philosophy? I'll put the link in the show notes. And I was going to bring this in later on when Vervaeke does mention Pierre Hadot. But this whole idea about the relationship between Christianity and ancient philosophy, and how Jonathan Pageau addressed this in a previous conversation about Stoicism. What happened to Stoicism? What happened to the Eleusinian mysteries? What happened to the Olympic Games? You can go to the Rest is History podcast on the Olympics, a couple of fascinating episodes. What happened to all of this stuff in the pagan world? It all gets subsumed and digested by Christianity. That doesn't mean it changes. It doesn't mean it doesn't change. It doesn't mean that some valuable things might not get lost in the process. But going back to all of this is sort of like saying, well, we reliably connected to the internet via modems, and we've really forgotten what it's like to have that modem sound. And I grew up hearing that, that modem sound when we were connecting to the internet, and I found that to be revelatory that we were connecting to the internet. And okay, but you've got fiber now. And the question is, can we reopen things with the modem? Well, there are some changes that happen with a modem, but we have to figure out how to assess the value.
And so it's a revelatory hypothesis, by which I mean, it's a hypothesis about the function of revelation in a society.
And now revelation for Jordan is a very interesting thing because he sometimes uses the word almost synonymously with insight. And whereas, let's say in a Christian frame, we would definitely connect revelation and insight. But again, if you go back to this idea about heaven and earth, revelation is something that comes from heaven to earth. Now, there's also general revelation and special revelation, and so Christians have for a long time understood distinctions within it. A big part of Jordan Peterson's contribution has been, in a sense, having a lower register understanding of, let's say, Darwinian revelation through the process and life of the church, that which endures. There's a revelation of a degree of truth by the things that endure and don't go away.
If these drug-induced, dreamlike...
Now, I had some, I hope I don't repeat myself, and if I do, I'm sorry, because I had the little mishap of hitting the wrong button and stopping recording, and I said a bunch of things which weren't recorded. Dreams are another great example of what we're talking about here. We all have dreams. We all reliably have dreams. Some of us remember our dreams better than others. Some of us dream more vividly than others, on and on and on. Some of us have dreams that we believe are revelatory. And the church has for a long time dealt with this kind of thing. When I was working with the Haitians, I've told this story before, one of the women came up to me and said, "I dreamed about you last night, missionary." I said, "Oh yeah, what'd you dream?" And she said, "Well, you were surrounded with fruit and flowers all around you." And I said, "Well, what does that mean?" Because I know that the Haitians put a lot of stock in their dreams. They're not a very buffered, the folks in Haiti do not experience themselves as buffered selves like we do here. And she said, "Well, that means you're going to have many children." And at that point, we had one child, and we didn't seem particularly fertile, and we went on to have 5. Is that revelation? 5 is a rather unusually sized family for secular America. It's by no means the biggest, and it's not enormously unusual, but it's unusual enough. Was that dream revelatory? And again, I think about some dreams that I've had that I have not shared with many people, but in some ways, I see part of what has happened via my YouTube channel and Estuary as the fulfillment of a dream that I had 20 plus years ago. I didn't take a psychedelic. And again, there's the standpoint epistemology. I know, what are you going to say? Well, just take the mushroom. I don't see the point. Partly because, again, with the question of divination, there's strong statements in Scripture about divination. The argument is there are spiritual entities that are above and beyond you, Balrogs, let's say. Don't tangle with them. Keep the door closed. Let God tell you what God wants to tell you. That's a part of Christianity, and this is part of the reason why you see the stiffening of the line between those here who are under the discipline and are committed Christians and those who are not. This is a line that Christians are very sensitive about.
States of religious experience are the fountain from which a culture like the Greek culture emerges. Well, what are we supposed to make of that ontologically? I mean, we're great admirers of the Greeks, right? We see our culture as certainly the rational element of it, and perhaps a tremendous amount of the aesthetic element as deeply rooted in Greek presuppositions. It's like, well, are the Eleusinian mysteries, that religious element, is that an aberration? Or is it that within which everything else is embedded?
I don't see the Eleusinian mysteries as an aberration. I see that as an example of, now obviously there were different cultures had different rites, but those kinds of things continue. I don't remember if I did talk about that because I reviewed some of the other videos. I don't see it as an aberration. I see it as part of the pagan world that basically, and if you go to, again, the rest is history, and you say, why did the Olympic Games stop?
And then the final event is you running in armor. So you dress up in armor and run.
Well, that's ludicrous because, of course, in the Greek weather, 38 degrees centigrade or whatever.
But that's where the Spartans come into their own.
Right. So they often win that, do they?
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, I guess so. And then everyone goes, that's it. And the winners on the fifth day, they all go to the statue of Zeus and they're given their olive crowns.
So, yeah.
And again, well, why do they go to the statue of Zeus? Well, if you listen to the whole podcast, you'll understand the deeply religious aspect of the ancient Olympics. This was today we don't look at it is deeply religious today, and they'll get into that in their treatment of the modern Olympics, but you just don't pull religion out of these things. And in a sense, as Pageau will later say, this is a terrifically modernistic example. Pageau says it, or someone said it in the comment section. This is intensely modernistic example. Here we have this substance, and this substance is supposed to afford us something. Well, what about the Olympics? Well, what would the Olympics have to do with any of this?
Yeah, Tom, that sounds awful. And you have comprehensively shattered any romantic faith I had in the ancient Olympics. So one quick question before we get on to some great Olympians. It continues after Greece has been absorbed into the Roman Empire, but non-Greeks are taking part. That's right, isn't it? So Roman emperors and other Romans. Now, is that general, or is it just big names, kind of VIPs?
It's basically Nero.
But didn't Tiberius take part?
Tiberius, he takes part in the question event. But by and large, it remains focused on Greece. So it goes into decline. In the early Roman period, Sulla, who's this kind of terrifying general who marches on Rome and kind of at the beginning of the 1st century BC, and he plunders Olympia and uses it to kind of fund his army in a civil war.
Yeah.
But then Augustus is very keen on it. Julia Claudius is very keen on it. Nero's massively keen on it. Hadrian, who is hugely into everything Greek, he's very keen on it. And it's very successful through the 2nd century. 3rd century, you get these Roman Empire kind of implodes into civil war, barbarians sweep across, goes into decline, and basically by the 4th century, it's on its last legs, and it kind of I think the last recorded mention of the games is, I think, 394, something like that.
Yeah. Theodosius the Great, isn't it? Doesn't Theodosius ban it, basically?
I'm not sure he bans it. I think it. I mean, that's. I think basically there's no market for it
because everybody has become Christian.
Everyone's become Christian, so nobody's going for.
So that sort of reinforces that point about it being religious rather than sporting, or sporting being religious. That they see it as a pagan festival. You know, the flies and the nudity aren't enough to compensate for the pagan religious connotations.
Well, Paul, when he writes to the Corinthians, makes reference to the Isthmian Games. So he says that as Christians we are competing for a higher crown.
Right.
Yeah. So his dissing of the games is there in the New Testament. I mean, basically, yes. If you're not worshipping Zeus, then what's the point? And the great statue of Zeus has been carted off to Constantinople. It's been taken there not as a kind of religious icon, but as a kind of cultural symbol. There's just no call for them.
And so, tell me about some You've got some.
So basically, this whole world just sort of gets subsumed. And back then to some of the videos I had about, neo-paganism. Well, these are attempts to try to, I think, get around or under Christianity, or in some way to sort of get around some of the blockages that we've made. And it's whatever you do with a substance today won't be anything like what happened with the Eleusinian mysteries. And Pageau, I thought, made that point tremendously clearly on Jordan's channel, and I think Pageau is right.
This is a fundamentally important question. It's not something trivial. I really don't know what to make of it, because it throws the whole problem of, the ontological significance of psychedelic substances into the mix, and that's a thorny problem if there ever was one. And that's a problem of the lower meeting the higher, that's for sure, right? These chemical substances that can reliably induce overwhelming mystical experiences. You can just set that aside and say, well, that's a form of insanity, but it's not schizophrenia. It's not obviously within the category of mental illness.
And Bishop Barron and Jonathan Pageau just hold their tongues.
And to Murray Rescue's hypothesis runs quite contrary to that. Not only is it not insanity, it was a vital source of revelatory knowledge, philosophical knowledge, and got the ball rolling in some sense. So God only knows what to make of that.
But, there's lots of experimental work being done on this right now, the Griffith Lab. I did an experiment in my lab, right? It's not epiphenomenal. People who have more mystical experiences have more meaning in life.
But again, for a modernist, meaning in life is epiphenomenal.
Reliable correlation. But
yeah, they become more open. Their personality undergoes a permanent transformation.
Well, at least long-standing, yeah.
A couple of years, anyways.
And this was interesting too, because I've heard Jordan talk about this quite a bit, but then John's saying, well, it's a couple of years, it's long-standing, but it's not permanent. Well, what's going on there?
It's not trivial. It's one standard deviation increase. It's a big difference.
So it doesn't sound like it's fundamentally biochemical. The experience seems to have something to do with it, as many experiences do.
And you have all of Yaden's work showing that when people have these experiences, they reliably improve.
And I'm having a psychedelic experience of bad internet, like a bad TV. Get fiber.
So a good friend of mine, who's a genius, by the way, and so I listened to what he has to say, and he's a technological genius. He talked to me about his mushroom experiences when he was a mixed up teenager, engaging in various forms of delinquent activity. And he said that after his psychedelic experience, his sense of what was right and what was wrong was massively heightened, and he abided by it from then on.
Yeah.
And I look at his life, it's like, well, you've accomplished a fair bit, and he's very solid.
Now, this sense of right and wrong, is that revelatory, or is it according to the standards of the day around him? So we get back to, let's see if this thing is still working. We get back to this little diagram. One of the issues that I come back to again and again is, okay, morality. Where does morality come from? In a traditional perspective, morality goes from heaven to earth. And come on, pen. There we go. Ooh, I can write. Morality goes from heaven to earth. So this new morality, is that revelatory, or has the experience now changed you in some way? And again, I am not about to say that everyone who has had a significant psychedelic experience has had a bad thing. I won't say that at all. I'm way too much of a pastor to know that people have all sorts of experiences, and sometimes very good experiences can lead them in bad places, and bad experiences can lead them in good places, and many of our experiences are just sort of our experience. And so we have to be a little bit careful in how we evaluate them.
Person, and quite the monster in the most positive way. And you can't just dispense with that. It's like, well, it taught him the difference between good and evil, and then he abided by that for the course of his life. And when Griffith's people have, his laboratory subjects have these mystical experiences, and they quit smoking.
Yeah.
And you think,
and if you take a look at this work, you'll see, like,
did they become Baptist?
So it's ontonormativity. People encounter what they call the really real. And it's really unusual, because normally what we do is we take these experiences that are disconnected from our everyday intelligibility, like a dream, and we say it's not real because it doesn't fit in. People do the opposite with these experiences. They say that was really real, and all of this has to change to get closer to it. Now, I think there's a way, though, of starting. This isn't going to be a complete answer, Jordan, but I think part of the reason why we find it problematic, these kinds of experiences, and this is what some of the empirical work I did showed, is because we've reduced rationality to inference, and we've forgotten that rationality is broader and includes insight. And if you think of how an insight works, and you can see a continuum between insight, flow, transformative experience. Even the flow experience has mystical aspects to it, and people get into it on a fairly reliable basis, right? And what we have to say is the core of rationality is not inferential coherence, it's the capacity for self-correction. And insight is one of our most powerful ways of self-correcting. I point to your own work. You showed in some of your experiments that, one of the things that predicts insight is the anomalous card sorting task, right? And you also showed that predicts how well people are overcoming self-deception. You did experiments on both of those. Right. And that's not a coincidence. Insight is one of the fundamental machineries by which we overcome how we fundamentally misframed. It's a fundamental self-correction. We need a model of rationality that includes them both.
Let me
And I think that was a very good response.
ask you about that. Let's go back to this nested idea, right?
I noticed the focus thing yesterday. I can't not see it every time we go to Jordan and single frame. Now Pageau wants to get in.
Can I just say something about psychedelics, which to me is important to mention, is that, obviously a lot of people are talking about it right now. And I did watch that interview with Murescu. And I think that in this question of psychedelics, I think we're actually seeing an increase of the problem that we're talking about, this kind of alienating problem, which is that psychedelics seems like a very nice solution because there it is. There's the mushroom. I can analyze the chemical substance. I can. So when we talk about the Eleusinian mysteries, now everybody's excited to talk about the spiked wine, but no one cares to talk about the entire ritual in which this was embedded. And it becomes this kind of weird reductive thing in which the tool that we can identify, which is, you can put it in a box and you can nicely identify it. Then everybody's attention goes there right now because of our kind of materialism and so I find it very difficult because, what we saw psychedelics do in the 60s is that ripping open the veil, supposedly, in a world where the ritual around, let's say, the coherence of society, the place where society coheres together and engages in a common ritual and in common attention and in common storytelling. And then we kind of throw this stuff out into a world that is individualistic and based on everybody's own little whims is not necessary, is going to, I think, and we saw it happen, is going to create these experiences that are frameless. And instead of binding, will continue to kind of fragment our society. I'm really worried about the psychedelics.
And I think Jonathan made a great point. I also think, again, okay, you want to have your psychedelic church? I'll tell you, in North America, you can start a church super easy. You've got significant constitutional protections for you. I have a friend who's a lawyer in the area of religion, and yeah, you can start your psychedelic church, and you can probably get all kinds of legal protection. I mean, they had the peyote case, and for Native Americans, and I mean, there's a lot there that you can build on. You can start your psychedelic church, and I think the questions are not so much, can we dig back under Christianity and sort of this move towards neo-paganism? I think the questions are, where exactly is it going to go? I don't think, there's a lot of, you can find a bunch of talk about Stoicism on on various YouTube channels. I don't think Stoicism as a movement is going to challenge Christianity. It's just not. And I don't think psychedelics as a movement are going to challenge Christianity because you can't build on it. It won't scale. And I think many of the issues that we're dealing with today, some of which have to do with sexuality, some of which have to do with some of these topics, you're not really going to build a civilization because it doesn't have the breadth. And the civilizations that were built on them are gone, and they're not coming back. Again, back to the Olympics. I think the Olympics and what happened with the Olympics proves Jonathan's or demonstrates Jonathan's point.
But, and I know how much you've been looking forward to me using the word sacral.
Yes, come on, let's get it over with.
Okay, so the key, really the fundamental difference between the modern Olympic Games, which as constituted now is basically about money. I mean, the reason that they're going ahead in a time of COVID, it's not because of the Olympic spirit. It's not because of the amity of nations. It's because of TV deals.
Yeah, well, we're going to do the modern Olympics, aren't we, in another podcast, so we can do all the sleaze and the politics of it.
But the episode you mentioned with Thermopylae, the Persians are invading Greece. This is a massive crisis. Holding the pass at Thermopylae is the best option the Greeks have to stop the Persian advance. But they don't go because of the games. And that's not because they're obsessed by sport, although they are. It's because the Olympic Games have this incredible status as something that is holy to the gods. And so again, Pausanias, when he goes to Olympia and he says about the games that there are basically the two holiest events in Greece. One is the mysteries at Eleusis, which is just outside Athens, where it's involved with the story of Demeter and Persephone going into the underworld and then coming back for 6 months and going back. And it's all basically about life and death. So it's absolutely at the heart of everything that a mortal might want to learn. But he says that the Olympic Games the Festival of the Olympics are on that level. And actually, when I say Olympic Games as a synonym for festival, that's wrong, because the games are only a part of the broader festival.
Let's go back to the origins. So when did their conventional date is 776, isn't it? And we get that from Aristotle, am I right? That he says it was 776 BC?
Yes, well, we get it also from a guy called Hippias of Elis. And Elis is the kind of the town that over the course of history comes to kind of monopolize and lay claim to the games and the festival. And essentially, if you win the sprint, which is the first race, and it's won by this butcher, supposedly called Coroebus,
right?
Then
nice.
From that point on, your name as the guy who wins the sprint, this is how the Greeks date. This is the dating system that they use. So it's kind of, how elite is that? You win a sprint and then your name, is going to be used forever after by people drawing up histories and like
just to interject on this, we were in Sparta the other day in modern Sparta, which is, as my son said, is not. It doesn't quite live up to his image of ancient Sparta. But in the middle of modern Sparta, there is a monument, an Olympic monument, and it has the names of every Spartan who won the Olympics, going back to the 8th century BC or whatever it is, and going right up to the early 21st century. And I thought, they're basically pretending there's no break. They're pretending that the Olympic Games are the same thing and that Sparta. So yes. I loved that was a sort of, that they're still remembering these guys, 2,500 years ago. And they still got this sort of monument to their Spartan Olympic heroes. So the names do live forevermore.
Well, yes. Yes, absolutely. And so Greek contenders knew that, the fame that you win is, in a sense, the kind of the key to it. But it won't surprise you to know that there are complications. So one of them is, is this true? And actually, the kind of the weight of opinion is probably that it vaguely is.
What, that the butcher did win and all that sort of stuff?
Yeah, perhaps. Who knows? We've got no way really of knowing, but it seems feasible. But this kind of, we can recognise that that's a historical account. But for the Greeks, I'm afraid I'm going to use the word, the sacral quality of the game.
Here we go. Yeah. I'm so glad you did that, Tom. I mean, it would be disappointing if you didn't.
I know. It's interwoven with myth.
Okay.
And so you can basically, with the Greeks, you can hold, kind of 3 or 4 ideas simultaneously in your head. So you can have this idea that there is a kind of recognizable starting point that you get on the blocks, firing gun goes and you're off. The games have begun. But at the same time, you also have to kind of enmesh it in your ideas about the stories told of the gods and the heroes. And as is always the way with Greece, there is no definitive account. So it's held at Olympia. Olympia, obviously, there's the resonance with Olympus, the home of the gods, where Zeus, the king of the gods, rules. And it's Zeus.
Is it named after Olympus, Tom? Is it named after Mount Olympus, the place? Or...
Well, it's named after Olympian Zeus. So Zeus presides over the games. And so, therefore, one of the stories that's told about the origins of the games, and again, going back to Pausanias, who really is a kind of, the crucial source for this, he says, some say Zeus wrestled there at Olympia with Kronos himself for the throne of heaven. Some say he held the games as a celebration of his triumph. Kronos was Zeus's father, who there was a prediction that he would be toppled by his child. And so he devours his children as they're born, and he gets tricked because Zeus's mother gives him a stone wrapped in swaddling clothes, and Zeus is then able to live and comes and defeats him. So that is kind of pinning the origins of the Olympics right to the beginning of the reign of the Olympians, the coming of the Olympians. So that's the kind of measure of its significance.
But Tom, I read this story, I read it only today, that Pelops, the son of Tantalus, a man who had survived being eaten by the gods, being served to the gods as food by his own father, which is not a claim many of us can make. But he had done this and lived to tell the tale, that he had a chariot race with his prospective father-in-law, in which he replaced the linchpins in the wheels of his father-in-law's.
Okay.
Yeah, can I just jump in? I'm sort of thinking out loud because I really loved in what both Jordan and John were saying is the way I
don't know how many comments Bishop Barron gets about psychedelics, because I didn't ever deal with this stuff until I met all you people on the internet.
Mystical is being described. There's something really right in that. I think when you have a true mystical experience, meaning an experience of God, of the sacred, it does have those effects that it convinces you that's really real, as opposed to the world it's real, but it's not as real as that. That now I'm clearer about good and evil. I mean, the authentically mystical, I think, has that. But when you talk about drugs and all that, look, for me, it's a closed book. I've never experienced that myself directly. But I'd also say this, the great mystics in the Western tradition, think of John of the Cross especially, who's my go-to guy. John of the Cross probably had what we call extraordinary experiences. Certainly his colleague Teresa of Avila did. I mean, visions and that sort of thing. But what did John of the Cross consistently say? Let go of them. Let go of them. When people said, oh, what do I do when I have an experience? See it. It's kind of a Buddhist thing. See it and let go of it. John of the Cross never wanted people like hanging on to the extraordinary vision or the extraordinary manifestation. So there is the mystical for sure. And I use my Platonic thing of going from, the cave, going from physics to mathematics to metaphysics. But beyond metaphysics, there is indeed this mystical dimension of knowing. So I don't discount that for a minute. But I've got a lot of John of the Cross in me that says, be very wary of hanging on to those. And to Jonathan's point there about, if I just take this drug, that's going to be my guaranteed path into the mystical. Whatever is going on there, the real mystical, tonight I'll be probably in front of the Blessed Sacrament at some point with the Rosary. And believe me, I'm not having any kind of LSD-like experiences, but that's the mystical as far as I'm concerned. So I'm trying to find what's really good in that description of it, which I think it really is accurate. But I'm wary of clinging to it.
There's one thing to be clear.
Go ahead.
Just to respond to Jonathan's criticism. I mean, the point that Jonathan is making is being recognized by people in the field. First of all, there's a distinction even in Griffith between a psychedelic experience and a mystical experience. And secondly, most people are clearly indicating, for example, all the therapeutic interventions using psychedelic, and the evidence is mounting that it's not the drug that does it. right? It is the drug in concert with the set and setting, the therapeutic framework, all of this other stuff and I consistently argue for this, you have to have this wrapped in a sapiential framework, because it can just as much take you off into self-deception as it can into self-correction. So
and the context, let's say at Johns Hopkins, is probably going to be a little bit different than your flight down to South America. I can't find the video right now. I just looked for it. But after one of the many little back and forths we've had over psychedelics, somebody sent me a video, and it was a rather impressive video of a young man and his story. It had a very troubled upbringing, had a very troubled past. Went down to South America, had an ayahuasca experience, and it really helped him sort some things out. Again, I'm pretty high in openness, and someone comes up to me, and I've had many people, in fact, some people that are close to me, tell me, well, you don't know what you're talking about with respect to psychedelics because you've never done it. True. But doesn't mean I don't have opinions. You're going to do with them what you will. But, it was quite a moving experience. But to imagine that, well, and then there's the question of what would you want from me? Do you want me to try them? Do you want me to recommend them? Those two places I'm not going to go.
So but I want to be clear that there's a lot of people that take the criticisms that have been made here very seriously, and it's actually woven into a lot of the research.
Yeah, well, it's interesting with regards to the scientism issue. So if you look at Griffith's research, so you see that his subjects take psilocybin and then they have a mystical experience and then they quit smoking or they're less afraid of death. It's like, and the way it's written up in the journal is it is bottom-up drug effect, because there's no description of the content of the mystical experience. It's like, well, the drug produces a mystical experience and then people don't smoke. And the scientific journal format only allows for that. And so, but then there's this question that's like, this is a big question. It's like, okay, well, why are these people no longer afraid of death? Like, did that switch just get turned off? Well,
the fact that the scientific journal doesn't have any place for the nature of the mystical experience is very interesting, because it continues to sort of show this blind side.
That's not how it works. The whole view they have of reality has been reoriented in some manner. And what manner? It's like, well, what happened exactly? That's an even more key question, and it's relevant to Jonathan's point. And then, John, to go after you a little bit on this topic, Jonathan is pointing to something that's a very intelligent caution, and that is that I know you know that, and these hypotheses of set and setting they're just the beginning of that surround that needs to be created to integrate these experiences into the broader culture. They're not much changed from the early 60s. Well, you have to be somewhere calm. You have to be with someone who, is going to take care of you. It's like, yeah, we're just barely beginning to figure out what to do with this. And then Bishop Barron, I believe, for what it's worth, and I don't know what you guys think about that, I think that Revelation is a psychedelic account. Literally.
Oh, the book of Revelation.
I really believe that. You bet. I think that the author of that had a
Bishop Barron's face.
Psychedelic experience, and all he did was write down what happened to him.
No, it's
and
too
that
grounded
might not
in
be right, but
it's too grounded in the Old Testament
That's right.
and the classic apocalyptic literature. I mean, it's
half
not
of it is quoting.
Why is that an objection? Yeah. Why is that an objection? He was grounded in that tradition.
So, I mean, Jordan's comeback is fairly valid. Again, to think about a buffered self, well, that's obviously within the buffer. Then it's a rearrangement. My take on the book of Revelation is that the book of Revelation is an updating of the Old Testament prophets through the lens of the resurrected Christ. That's what the book of Revelation is. And it's told in an apocalyptic genre.
And all of that tradition was made vivid in imagery during the experience. That's certainly not beyond the...
I mean, imagine just think about what you do when you do almost anything creative. I'm not trying to draw a one-to-one correlation here, but how can I mean, I watch artists do this all the time. Artists sit down and look at the stuff that Jonathan Pageau does. These images come out of someplace, and they're coming out of everything that's been put into them in many ways.
The confines of such experiences. So, and I think the church is going to have to wrestle with this seriously in the years to come, because there's an
Well, and I agree with that. And I would like to see the church wrestle with it, but wrestling with it is not going to include me taking these substances. I mean, if a bunch of you can get really irate about the vaccine, I'm gonna be stubborn about this.
association between psychedelic use and revelatory meaning.
Again, when he says revelatory, does he mean insight? Because often when he uses revelatory, I think about the first Vancouver conversation with Sam Harris and Brett Weinstein. That tends to be the way that he uses it. In other words, he tends to use revelation in terms of lower register type things
that the church is going to have to grapple with, I believe.
Well, there are plenty of monks
because
who
these
have
things are coming.
revelations and have visions and have all these types of experiences, but that don't take psychedelics. It's actually through asceticism and through transformation. And I think this is coming back to Bishop Barron's point, is that, let's say, in the hesychastic tradition, in the mystical tradition of the East, it's exactly like what he said about St. John of the Cross. They consistently insist that the mystic has to ignore all experiences, because the purpose is not to have experiences. The purpose is to be united with God, to be transformed, to be free of your passions, to be free of the things that kind of bind you. And it's going to happen. And maybe that can actually be somewhat instructive for others, but that's not the point. And so I think that I understand it, because there's something about our world too that wants experiences, right? We want to have these exciting or very kind of exciting experiences, but the real purpose is to be transformed, which is why someone is willing to be martyred, or someone is like, that has nothing to do with like having a really great mystical experiences. There's something about,
and I think part of this conversation is going to have to go deeper into this question of transformation. Jordan's talked about that multiple times. His conversation with David, he's the pastor at Liberty, David Nasser. Many of my conversations with John Vervaeke. Transformation, again, isn't simply sort of a blank slate. When we talk about transformation, we talk about something going up. Well, it's going up towards a telos. It's going up towards some place where it will reside, and we want to imagine this thing to be good. Now, we tend to do this. I've been talking until these things dropped. We've been talking about betterment, and there's proximal betterment, and then there's ultimate. And I think then there's also the question of absolute. And okay, so we sort of dead reckon these proximal betterments, and okay, they've stopped smoking. Well, in a society that believes that smoking is bad for your health, that's a positive thing. That includes the Baptists, okay? So there's betterment, and there's proximal betterment. But one of the things that I see with people all the time, let's see, can I move these things around? Oh, cool. Will this move? I don't know. I'm just playing with the whiteboard here. Well, that moved. Okay. I was going to, so Ian McGilchrist did, I thought, a really good conversation with Rebel Wisdom. Now with McGilchrist, everything always sort of pretty quickly goes into process theology, and that's another conversation. But this question of, so when you get very practical into something, let's say someone is having difficulty in their marriage, is divorce betterment? Well, that's kind of hard to say, because you don't get to run the experiment backwards. Rick says I should really work on my handwriting, and he's right. Is divorce betterment? Hard to know. Would you be better with point A or point B? Now, often, not resolving things can lead to transformations. Sometimes what needs to happen in a marriage, if one thing that a marriage, even a difficult marriage, can provoke is a transformation, because usually 50% of the misery in the marriage is one of you. The other 50% is probably the other. And so staying in it can result in a transformation. So again, it's awfully tempting to say, well, we can put these transformations in a pill, and the rest of the conversation has been saying, oh, that's not quite that simple, because you have the question of, well, what is the direction of the transformation? Is the transformation really betterment? And what do we mean by that? Because the question of the good is going to be situated in a moral universe. So we say smoking is bad. We say fear of death is bad. I'm not going to challenge either of those things. We would, although in some contexts, say that fear of death is actually quite a good thing. Don't do that foolish thing, walking too close to the edge. Well, I'm not afraid of death. Well, that really doesn't mean you should die right now because you rather clumsily fell off a cliff. All of this stuff is nested in a world. And so when we talk about transformation, that too is nested in an entire moral landscape.
It really is about the transformation of the person into the image of Christ, let's say.
Jonathan, is it true? I'm curious in the Eastern traditions, I don't know as well, but in the West, certainly, the mystics all talk about God actively stripping these things away. So even something like the great contentment I get in the beginning of my relationship with God, my sense of consolation, to use Ignatius' term, God will take that away, because
I recently talked to someone who, converted to Christianity, and they've been in it now for a while. And this is exactly, they said, I've kind of cooled off compared to, when I first became a Christian, everything was new and fresh, and insights were coming into things, and now it's getting comfortable. Is there something wrong? I said, this is a pretty normal part of the process. Similar thing happens in marriage or in a relationship. You have that period of infatuation, and at some point it's going to have to settle into something more stable.
I'm not meant to fall in love with the consolation. I'm meant to fall in love with God. So I'm not meant to fall in love with the mystical experience or with the vision or whatever. I'm meant to fall in love with God. And so God actively, John of the Cross will talk about the dark night of the soul, and that's really what he means. It's not a psychological state. It's God actively taking away these experiences because there's something else that we're really talking about.
In the Eastern tradition,
So I haven't had a chance to listen to the whole thing yet, but I was really enjoying this conversation that Nick and John. I met Nick in real life. He came to a meetup. He was in Bethel, north of us, and John I had a conversation with not too long ago. But talking about their experience in the Charismatic Church, revelations are all over the place, and a lot of what it has taken in Charismatic Pentecostal traditions has been to basically build up a tradition around all of these reported, experienced, revelatory experiences. And again, Christian Christian liturgy is designed, Christian hymnody is designed, Christian practice is designed to get us into flow states, to get us into states where we're having these different level of mystical experiences. But what you do then around it in terms of the institution is to figure out, okay, now how can we keep this productive and not destructive? And again, that's why my challenge, you're going to start your DMT church. My guess is you're not going to really be able to scale it, because you're going to have everybody doing their own thing, having their own experiences. And if these experiences are considered revelatory, it's going to be chaotic. And in fact, this is why, as I mentioned in that little video, it's really interesting that Christians, and the West grew out of this, pay a lot of attention to the physical layer of reality. And that's why the physical resurrection of Jesus has always been the cornerstone of the church, because I saw Jesus. Well, good for you. But it's the physical resurrection that we build our hope on.
The highest point is absence of all image and thought.
Right. Yeah. Right.
That you actually don't have any. There's no imagination. There's no thought. There's nothing. There's only this kind of pure presence and this pure light, let's say, that kind of.
Now this is kind of an interesting statement, given a lot of the conversations back and forth with John Vervaeke, especially that one that they had, which got so esoteric so fast. How high up does narrative go? And now John is basically saying, well, at the top, there's no narrative, which is sort of John Vervaeke's point.
Gathers you into God. So it is, and they constantly say the same thing. They say all these experiences, let them go. You got to drop them. Don't become a guru and, kind of teach out of your little mystical insight, but rather just drop it and keep going up the ladder, let's say.
Well, right.
And if you want to look at the Pentecostal church, there's a lot of people that they had this vision and they ran with it. And, if you're around Pentecostals long enough, or even non-Pentecostals, you watch how that thing plays out. I see a lot of people with very little experience about the church having a lot of ideas about how things should happen, let's say, in the church. They have very little experience in the church or in church leadership. And the truth is, the church is running these experiments, especially with Protestantism. The church is running these experiments all the time. And you can watch them play out if you just know where to look.
I mean, I'm very wary of the idea that the communion cup, the origins are in some kind of psychedelic experience. I mean, trust me, it's never happened to me. I've been going to Mass since I was a kid, because the reality of it is other than that. I mean, even if there was something, and certainly the Eleusinian mysteries have been well studied, and perhaps there was a psychedelic element and so on, but I would never want to put stress on that.
I would want to say that, first of all, I talked to Aidan Lyon, who was his book is coming out, A Psychedelic Experience, a philosophy of psychedelic experience. First of all, he doesn't pin the term on the use of psychedelics per se. It just means mind revealing experience.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And so what I would say is that the substances belong to a class that don't require chemical substances. So these are disruptive strategies. Jonathan mentioned, ascesis, right? Asceticism.
Yeah.
The shamans chanting, the drumming, the sleep deprivation. There's a whole family of disruptive strategies. But let me try and show you.
You can find my conversation with John Vervaeke on shamanism and Christianity, both on my channel and on his, and on the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis Discord server.
What I think this is related to, if you're having a problem because you've misframed the situation and you need an insight, what's actually really good for an insight is to be moderately distracted from the problem. Or it's like if you're trying to solve an insight problem on the computer screen and I put a bit of static or noise into it, that will actually help you break up the inappropriate frame and find a new frame. You do the same thing with neural networks. Neural networks are trying to learn, and you periodically have to throw in noise, because if you don't throw in noise, they'll get too narrow and too fixed on what they're picking up on. So this is what I meant. I did a talk about this. It's like insight requires these disruptive strategies, and they look exactly the opposite from our model of rationality. So I think a more appropriate thing, because I mean, I see disruptive strategies in St. John of the Cross. I certainly see those. And of course, they're all the way through the Neoplatonic tradition. And they can be cognitive disruptive strategies. Nicholas of Cusa puts you like, that an infinite circle is also a straight line and you go like that, right? So I think.
No, I'm with you on that. I'm with you on that. I'm thinking of Thomas Merton used the Buddhist term, calming the monkey mind. And he thought that was the purpose of the rosary. Yeah. And I was conducting a retreat, this is about 3 years ago, with the priests of Dublin. Now,
I took a little bit of heat from a few people on where I ranked Bishop Barron in this conversation. And again, I'm a fan of Bishop Barron. I think he's at his best in this conversation when he's the most personal. And maybe the being a bishop sort of restricts them. I understand that being a clergy restricts me. If I had a large church or if I were a denominational official, I would not be doing these videos. Probably get myself in trouble. Anyway, when he starts talking in a much more personal sense, and again, I saw this also in his conversation with Jonathan Pageau. He seemed more relaxed in there. The more personal he gets, I think the more winsome he becomes, especially in a conversation like this.
Irish, so this is in my cultural DNA. But they were praying the rosary one night. There's about 60 men. And they prayed the rosary, which normally takes about 25 minutes to do it at usual pace. They finished it in about 6 minutes. And it was, Hail Mary for the great source, Hail Mary for the great source, Hail Mary. But at first it seemed ludicrous, but what it was doing was setting up just that kind of buzz, that sort of mantra-like quality that I think does allow something to happen, that allows something to happen in deeper parts of the psyche, deeper parts of the soul. So I think that's right. I agree with those elements are there in the mystical tradition.
And I see people do this in church all the time in their own ways. And this is where the neo-sacrament or the sacramentalist churches and the neo-sacramentalist churches tend to have an advantage, but it's also, there's always kind of two sides to it. It's the repetition of the place, and it's both the repetition and the disruption. It's just part of how human beings manage our contact between the registers.
Jesus' prayer too, Jonathan's an example of that, I think.
Yeah, and so for me, as a scientist, I'm studying these things. Like when I did the one experiment I mentioned, the content, which I think is supportive of Jonathan's point, isn't the key thing that's predictive of the changes in people. It's predictive of the relationship to meaning in life. It's actually the insight process rather than the particular phenomenological content that seems to be driving the transformation.
The Christian ascetic
and that's what John said right there. That probably did more in terms of saying, okay, now I can sort of have an understanding of how use of these drugs have helped people. Because again, a few years ago when this came up, I had never had any experience, and some people close to me, people I dearly love, people who I trust, have told me about their experiences. And what John said right there was, I thought, one of the best framing of when I hear them talk about it. That's what I think the good of it has come. It's in that sense that it's come through.
The Christian mystic, this insight gathering, or this kind of mounting up into insight, is bound up in the transformation of the person in terms of their own passions, and also the transformation of the community in terms of liturgy and participation in communion. And so it's buffered, like I said, it's binding. It's not just someone, doing something to get some insight, but it ends up being this binding of the like, if what Bishop Barron was talking about, all these monks sitting together, doing the rosary together, and then maybe going into liturgy and taking communion together and working together. And so there's something more than just the kind of psychological or personal experience or personal healing from this or that problem, but it's a holistic thing. I hate using that word, but it's a whole.
And I think Pageau is exactly right there. And I think this is exactly why psychedelic church won't work. Because what you want is something that's communal, something that's more public, something that can be shared. One of the things that my wife and I do together often is watch TV. But we watch TV together, and we do it with the remote, and we pause and we talk about it. Men often do things together. Why? Because it affords a certain degree of community. And I think by its nature, taking a substance and doing something on your own is individualizing. And that's why I think you're not going to have a psychedelic community develop,
Holistic process, let's say.
Well, it goes both ways, right? The insight isn't just propositional; it's perspectival and procedural. And I think mystical experience is the most profound version of participatory knowing. I mean, I think, I could make a very strong Neoplatonic argument. And I think I agree with you, Jonathan. You see this in some of the things I've been doing the ethnographic work on, where people do the circling. You can get shared insight flow that doesn't belong to any one person. It belongs to the community as a whole, and people, right? And I think that's very important.
And that's probably not going to happen when you're vomiting in a bucket or not being able to see straight.
Important for, as you said, making sure that this doesn't, it's so easy for these experiences to become a magnet of narcissism for people, right? And so the decentering that happens when we are...
Which I think is exactly what Paul was talking about in 2 Corinthians 12.
Immersed in something larger than ourselves, which I think helps cultivate the virtue of reverence. I absolutely agree with you. I think that absolutely has to be the case. And I've argued it repeatedly for that. I hope I'm not coming across as trying to say it's an individual personal thing that I'm talking about. That's not fundamentally what I'm talking about. I'm talking about it being systemic in the individual and systematic throughout the community.
So let me, Jonathan, I'm curious about this. Your cautions are duly noted on my end. I see what happened, say, in retrospect, when the hallucinogens were introduced to Western culture, right? It didn't work very well. And look at what happened to Timothy Leary. So, for example, I had his old job at Harvard, by the way.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's great.
Yeah.
Yes.
Many people have pointed that out to me, Jordan, by the way.
Jesus, of all the weird things. In any case,
Jordan Peterson is just a weirdness lightning rod. Stuff strikes him.
Che Eliade also believed that the true shamanic tradition wasn't psychedelic driven. No, and that was an aberration. I think he was wrong. I really do believe that he was wrong. And I think that, and I'm also not entirely convinced that the practices that you're describing can produce experiences that are as intense as those that are produced chemically. Maybe they are, but even if they are, they're not available to.
Intensity of experience is not an easy thing to measure in the way that we want to measure. Now, maybe I'm wrong. There might be someone out there saying, no, we can. Well, how do we measure the intensity of the experience? And to what degree is intensity related to quality?
To the typical person, they take tremendous amount of training, and then so that's a big problem. And then
is that a problem or is that a feature? To me, it seems like a feature.
Yeah, look, it's a feature too, Jonathan, because maybe you need to do all that training to handle the insight. Yeah. And I'm not trying to look for a facile solution here, believe me. But the church has a hard time attracting people at the moment. And
okay, now we're. Oh, this is the answer? This is where, of course, Bishop Barron's going to talk about what he talks about fairly often. He spent a fair amount of time with Jonathan Pageau on it too. But it's very interesting to me how often Peterson comes back to the poor performance of the church. And okay, fair enough. You didn't get a chance to buy the one in Toronto. This again had some of this in the comments on the first video. I don't see him becoming Catholic. He seems in his orientation Protestant, and maybe if he sticks to this psychedelic thing. He'll try to go the way of the psychedelic church, and I think he'll very quickly see that it doesn't work. There was Jesus and John the Baptist, and a lot of people don't understand how big a movement John the Baptist was. John the Baptist is no longer around in the same way Jesus is around. And there's something about systems. Fascinating end to Nate Heil and Michael Martin and John Vervaeke's conversation on Sophiology, on Grail Country, on that channel. And it ended with the church, and I really want to do some treatment of that video too, because I don't think psychedelics are going to help church growth. I think there are many churches. The Pentecostal churches have been some of the fastest growing churches around the world, and they, in fact, reliably provoke in people modernist frame breaking. It happens all the time in Pentecostal churches. People leave and they have a conversion experience. Maybe they fell on the floor. We've talked a little bit about, Toronto Blessing and some of these things. John Wimber, you can find John Wimber taught at Fuller Seminary. You can find some of his books. You might look up his book, Power Encounter, and story after story of basically no substances involved. The power of what happened in that church broke through. This happens all the time. And it happens around the world. And it happens cross-culturally. And it happens without any chemicals going in anyone's mouth, because all of the chemicals are being triggered reliably in people's brains by the set and setting of everything that is happening. And people are transformed. Now, maybe, Jordan needs to go to the right church and get whammied. And it kind of reminds me of Jordan and Sam Harris talking about, Jordan basically saying, maybe you haven't taken enough to break through your determined atheism. But again, I go back to C.S. Lewis in the beginning of his book, Miracles. The only person that he knows that saw a ghost didn't believe in ghosts. Experience has its limitation, and it lives within the frames that we live, and we're tremendously complex and subtle creatures with respect to our belief systems and the systems that we participate in publicly.
I don't know what's happening in the broad church with regards to the sort of work, for example, that Griffiths is doing. And it's not like I have the answers to these things, but
What's very interesting is again, if we would bring, well, maybe I should probably have Nick on the channel. Nick watches. Because Nick was at Bethel. So Bethel in Northern California, 2 hours north of here. If Jordan wants to go and watch transformations and signs and wonders and people getting really serious at it, go to Bethel. Now, what happens in many of these Pentecostal churches is they approach it in a very modernistic way. There is a toolbox, how to work miracle manuals that are all over the place. And, when I hear Jordan talking about, psychedelics and the church, he's approaching it with techne. And part of what's foundational to the church is that we don't just approach things with techne, because that is idolatrous. We approach God with the spirit of finesse as doulos, as slaves, as servants, and we ask for God to fill us because we are empty. Whenever we approach with a spirit of geometry, when we approach in order to use God, that will not end well. That will not end well.
We shouldn't look to the psychedelics as a savior, certainly, but they should also not be discounted, because they are the means by which people can have the sorts of experiences that the scientists, the followers of scientism, discount. It's right there. It's right there as proof in some sense.
Or at
maybe
home,
that's
though,
irrelevant to the
with
church.
using the wisdom tradition.
Maybe that's irrelevant to the church. It's not irrelevant to the church. Again, go to an Assemblies of God church and pay, or go to a Vineyard church, or go to Bethel. Jordan, if you want to come to Northern California, I'll go to Bethel with you. And I'm sure with the status that you've got, I'm sure we could have an audience with Bill Johnson. Read Bill Johnson's books. I've got them here. Here's two of them I have in my Kindle library. I've got The Supernatural Power of a Transformed Mind. Pentecostals are all over this. And here's Bill Johnson's thesis. The will of God is simply on earth as it is in heaven. Isn't that basic? Isn't that refreshing when we pray, thy kingdom come, thy will be done? When we pray for God's dominion and will be realized right here, right now. That is life-transforming, paradigm-shattering way to do normal Christianity. And they will go through, they'll have a school, and they will teach you all of this stuff. And Rick's always looking for better camera angles and how to juice up Livingstone's streaming experience. And so sometimes he goes to Bill Johnson's and Bethel's website, and they've got lots of money for the best cameras, and they've got all the technology. And then I just tuned in once, and if I recall correctly, Bill Johnson was up there, and he was thanking people for praying for his wife who had cancer. And part of my problem is John Wimber died. And these are theological issues that the church has been dealing with for a very long time. And in many ways, the psychedelic questions, as I've known plenty of people who have spoken in tongues. They have seen visions. They have dreamed dreams. They have lived in many ways, sometimes in shallow ways, the mystical life. And you know what? They left it. Hasn't really transformed them. And that sort of brings in what Jonathan was talking about in terms of there's a quality of this that comes in, set and setting, and the entire narrative of one's life. Tammy's story of the vision with respect to her healing, her miraculous healing, was that done on psilocybin or DMT or something like that? Didn't appear so with her telling of it. It simply happened. And I'm not a skeptic about any of this stuff that this comes. What I am a skeptic of is the systemization of it, because that is frankly idolatrous. We always come to God with open hands asking to be filled. Jesus himself goes into the garden and says, if this cup may pass from me, not your will but mine be done. That is always the posture of the faith.
Jordan, as you've been doing, the fact that you're drawing a lot of people back toward Christianity through the opening up of the Bible and the wisdom way of reading the Bible, that to me is a great way the churches can start drawing, especially young people, back. It's obviously working in your case. We've got our problems, and some of it came from the scandals, certainly, but some came from an exaggerated attempt to be relevant to the society and to sort of dumb down our language and to make us sound like an echo of the culture. That's what did us in, I think, in terms of attracting younger people.
This has gone on quite a while. In some ways, Nate said it well, Nate Heil, and I think he was right. It's kind of an unfortunate redirection of this conversation in the whole psychedelic route. It's obvious that it's something that Jordan is working on, and I think if he's serious about the church coming to grips with this, okay, but it's probably going to be within the context of Pentecostal Christians, African Christians, Charismatic Catholics. The church is absolutely replete with various kinds of pattern disrupting techniques that run the gamut of so much of it. Now, maybe in whatever kind of mainline church Jordan remembers from his childhood, it was stale and frozen and utterly modernistic, which is exactly what Bishop Barron is going to be complaining about. But to imagine that this stuff is not present in the church, that mystical experiences, dreams. Caught an article today on Twitter, The Strange New Habit of the Global Church. From its humble beginnings, the Christian church has grown to be the world's largest religious community, the majority of whom reside in the global south, Asia, Africa, and Latin America, or as it is called, the majority world. Africa is now the biggest Christian continent, and Latin America will also soon outstrip Europe in terms of numbers of Christians who reside there. Consequently, most church members in the near future and already now will not be adult European, North American, Caucasians, but people of all ages, genders, and ethnic backgrounds across the world. And ask the United Methodists what this does to their ideas of changing the assumptions about gender and sexuality. In a nutshell, the picture of the world church in the beginning of the third millennium, that message, however, is only slowly gaining ground in theological education and literature. The reader of the typical textbook in the doctrine of the church and, say, the student listening to a lecture in a classroom in too many theological schools may wonder if the author and the lecturers live in a different world from Christians in the world church, in whose writings and presentations it looks as if the surrounding world has not experienced any major changes relevant to life and mission of the church. But by and large, doctrines of the church were still written as if Christendom model were in place, making Christians virtually the only world religion, with an established mainline churches as the only player in the field of well-to-do Europeans and Americans, the majority of the faithful. Of course, leaders and theologians are supposedly mainly aging white men. Yet how radically different is the world of the third millennium in which the global church and its mission exists? Nothing less than a radical transformation is happening. And now there's a lot going on in this. The composition of the church worldwide with regard to denominations is changing dramatically. As of this writing, 1/2 of all Christians are Roman Catholic, another quarter comprise Pentecostal or Charismatics, and the rest are Eastern Orthodox, Christians, Anglicans, mainline Protestants, and members of the Free Church. This means that Roman Catholics and Pentecostal Charismatics together constitute 3/4 of the global membership. To imagine the church is this sort of frozen place of staid rationality is just not getting out there and seeing what's happening. Now, that's where, in a lot of ways, a lot of Vervaeke's questions come in terms of error checking. And this is actually what a lot of the church does through its structure, through its community. So maybe this is a good place to end. So I didn't get this done in 2 parts. And maybe this will be the worst of my commentaries, but I don't know. You'll let me know. I know you will. That's why you're my third lobe.